What a wonderful prayer to start this evening session. Thank you, Joni, for the insight wherever you are. To say that that song would be the one to use is absolutely perfect in the light of what we're doing. I think it was Henry Nouwen who said, a lot of people think that the opposite of love is hate, and some people would say the opposite of love is just really not caring. He believes that the opposite of love is fear. It's hard to be loving and fearful at the same time. If that's true, how wonderful that we started with a prayer that said, "Be not afraid." We have a God who's always with us, asking us to follow him, even into the dark and hurtful parts of life. For those who weren't here yesterday, I just kind of had a few major sections. One of them was reminding us of how much we're loved by our God. And there's a handout, I think, in the back. Maybe is it on the book? The place where the books are, I'm not sure. But back there is a handout you might want to pick up. It's a lot of scripture quotes that are a really good reminder of God's love. The second part, we went into the fact that that love was manifested in a very human Jesus. And I kind of encouraged all of us to look maybe even more fully than we have before at what it means that Jesus was human, so that he can truly be a companion for us as we go through everything in our own lives, and not just see him as a figure to shout out to every now and then, but more and more as an intimate friend with whom we can relate. And then we moved a little bit more specifically into the theme, being loved by God and being companioned by Jesus. Now, what do we do with the pain in our lives and the suffering in our lives? And as I said, pain is something that might be an objective reality, that something happens to us and it hurts. But suffering might be the other 90%, and it's made up of all the different ways that we respond to what happens. That's where a whole lot of life is. And then we finished with a little guided imagery meditation. I hope you found that helpful. It was a little on the brief side, but hopefully, since Jesus is, walking out with you, it isn't just here or in my words, obviously, you can continue the conversation. So tonight, again, for the teachers who are here, there are 4 parts. Outline it a little bit. One of them, I talked a little bit about the ways we avoid pain and suffering in our lives. There are very creative ways of trying to get around it that nonetheless create more in the long run. So I talked about some of those. But in the first part tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit more positively about our approach to suffering. And then in the second part, how it can transform us in a particular way. And then at the third part, we'll get to the cross of Jesus. And fourth, how, because of the cross of Jesus, our wounds can be transformed. So that's just a little coming events. I worry about that sometimes because I say, in some ways, when I have 4 parts, people can say, okay, I know where he's going, and there we are. Other people can say, when I get to, and now I go to the third part, because he's only on the third part. Got one more to go after this. Jeez. A mother tells the story of her older son teaching the younger one how to ride a 2-wheel bike. At one point, when things weren't going all that well, she overheard the older son say to the younger one, whose nickname was Boo. He said, "Face it, Boo, there's no way to learn to ride a bike without losing some skin." And the mother just smiled and said, I've taught them well. What insight and wisdom he has. Yep, we all lose some skin, and we all get back on our bikes, and we pedal again, trying to look forward and not at the pedals, because that can be dangerous, and move into our next encounter with human imperfection, whatever form that surprise might take. Such imperfection is discovered even in our liturgies, and I like the kind that show up especially in the innocent and occasional mistakes made by lectors from time to time, in other parishes, of course, not yours. A reading from the letter of Paul to the Philippians. Or the Filipinos, I've heard that too. there was a deacon who was a really nice guy in my home parish, but he shouldn't have been let anywhere near a microphone. He really should have helped the poor and not played around with liturgy. He had the one gospel, and he preached that day too, and repeatedly said that Jesus said to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And he couldn't see our stomachs going up and down with laughter, and he just kept going. Or one more who proclaimed with very somber authority, avoid immortality. I think there's an extra T there. Good luck with avoiding that, since that's what we were made for. There are some others that I probably really shouldn't say. Well, here we are in our beloved human, imperfect humanity, which necessarily includes the experiences of pain and suffering, along with all the wonderful events of our lives and experiences that we have with them. Someone suggested that religion, in terms of the whole history of religions, might be described as what we do with our pain. Now, that might be taking a little bit too much of a chunk out of a description, but that's what somebody said. And as I reflected with you last night, there are all sorts of ways that we can ignore or numb or run from pain for a while. There is an alternative, however, which includes making peace with the unchangeable, choosing the attitude that we're going to take toward this unwanted and uninvited reality in our lives. We are free people and have the freedom to be bitter and angry if we'd like. We can let the wounds fester. I've often said, if I know that I'm wounded on my forearm and I'd rather not expose it, it's going to fester, it's not going to heal. Exposing it means, somebody else might see it, and it means it's going to hurt when the medicine's put on it, but that again is a short-term healing of what could be a long-term problem that gets much worse. We also have the freedom to choose a more dignified and hopeful attitude towards suffering and walk right into the darkness of our hurts and losses and expose our wounds for the purpose of healing. To face them, to name them, to cry and scream and lament about them, to share them with somebody else and not hold them all to ourselves, and then to sit with them quietly and rock them gently until God breaks through and does something unexpected and brand new that we in our poverty of words call healing. Now I know that sentence was a mouthful, so let's break it down a little. And let's do it very concretely, so that while I'm talking, please have in mind your own examples, maybe some of them that you thought about last night. The list that I gave you obviously isn't exhaustive, but I trust that you know the physical and emotional and interpersonal and spiritual experiences that you would describe as pain or grief, or maybe as distress or disruption, affliction, maybe in some cases oppression or discrimination, any sense of loss, of hurt, of being victimized, and in all those cases, not being in control, which might be another description of suffering, just not being in control. I invite you to think of one or two examples from your life as I share with you these 3 steps of one Christian response to suffering, as expressed by the author back in 1975. Her name is Dorothy Soel. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure. Or Soleil, I don't remember. And it's simply called Suffering, the book. Before she even comes to step 1, she challenges a kind of passivity, like, I'm just not going to respond at all, or a false kind of otherworldly piety that she would call Christian masochism. Again, that's the thing I hinted at yesterday. It's good to suffer. No, it isn't. Something might come of it, but it's not a good in itself. Rather, she very realistically states that the first step, and this is something we all already know probably when it's big enough, we're just going to be dumbfounded by it. It's so good that she named it. We're mute. Where did that come from? We might need all the energy we have just to survive. Don't give me any more steps. I got to let this hit me first. And I know in my own life, when I remember such things as hearing the news of my best friend Sue's car accident, my mom's stroke, my friend Tony's second diagnosis of leukemia, and away from the health news, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against my community for something that one sick priest did 45 years ago. I'm glad that this author says it's okay to be dumbfounded at first, because every one of those put me into shock of some kind. And I bet that's your experience too. Then, says Soel, the second step is to be conscious of the experience, to bring it to explicit consciousness. This is what, I've gotten over the shock, this is what happened. And whatever the cause is, to give that pain a voice, to express it somewhere outside yourself. It might just be screaming in the forest somewhere in the woods, or it might be expressing it to God, or it might be expressing it to some trusted person in my life. Not just trusted, but the kind of person that I know isn't going to give me immediate advice or say, you think that's something. Wait till I tell you about how much I hurt. A lot of times when elders get together, they do so for organ concerts. Are you familiar with those? Livers, hearts, kidneys. My organ's worse than yours. And if we need help in expressing such things, let's go to our sacred book, and especially to the book of Psalms. It's full of people being gutsy and visceral and real and raw about their feelings. And these Hebrew people aren't afraid to be honest with God out of the depths. They could say to God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you forgotten us? Those are the words that Jesus picked up from one of the Psalms when he was on the cross himself. This is not despair. This is not a bad thing to do. What would God think if I yell at God? This is not infidelity. It's a very prayerful and appropriate lamentation that acknowledges suffering in a way that eventually will empower me to respond to it and act and not be completely paralyzed by it. Now here's one of 2 or 3 quotes of the night again to put on your bumper stickers or signs. We can't heal what we don't feel and reveal. We can't heal what we don't feel and reveal. This isn't pop psychology either. This is Jewish spirituality, which Jesus knew well. When we suffer in silence, perhaps because we don't want to bother or upset someone else, what happens sometimes is that instead of having the feeling begins to have us. And we become enslaved. Think of your own experience, whatever is on your mind right now or in your heart. How have you expressed it, or how haven't you, but could you express it? And what were the results of both, saying it or not saying it? And then third, she says, comes the call to action. So what I might constructively be able to do in response to my experience of loss and pain. Now this one might be a long time in coming. I might not be ready for a while. But maybe I'll decide that I would really be well served by some professional help. Whether it's a spiritual counselor, pastoral counselor, whether it's a therapist. Maybe it's a support group. I might be called by this experience to carry my cross in such a way that the experience can change me. And we're invited to be open to that possibility. And part of the change might be that it leads me to compassionately work for such change in others. Whether it be just reaching out to a friend, or whether it's something that's more systemic, like making political or social changes of whole groups of people who suffer. All of that becomes then part of Christ's redemptive work, and it all came from my pain that woke me up to something that I wasn't too terribly aware of until I felt what a lot of other people feel. And all of a sudden, here I am working for the reign of God that starts here and now and then continues. To actively cope with my own challenges puts me in a shared solidarity with everybody else who's hurting. We're in this together, and we can grow from it together. That's really where the church community comes in, and I'm going to say more about that tomorrow. Yesterday I was talking more about the influence on our relationship with God. Today's with ourselves. Tomorrow's with one another. In her writing, however, and I really want to add this part because it's awfully important, Dorothy Sowell also sensitively includes the possibility that sometimes the suffering just seems insurmountable and meaningless. So it's not a quick 3-step and we're out. I talked yesterday about my friend Tony, my brother Servite, who ended emails even in the middle of his leukemia and other cancers, that God is good, but that's not the whole story. In November, before he died, I had already been invited to lead this parish mission. And I told him I'm supposed to be talking about something called redemptive suffering, however it gets articulated. And he, who had been through 4 kinds of cancer and a lifetime of surgeries, looked at me and said, "You know, John, despite my faith and a life of ministry to others, I don't see anything redemptive in the pain I'm feeling right now." And I just had to be quiet. I had no response. I was a little stunned, not completely surprised afterwards, because I didn't know how much pain he had. And I just accepted where he was. Our response to people doesn't have to sound holy. It doesn't even have to sound. It just has to be authentic, which at times means saying nothing. In the scriptural book of Job, he was confronted by the 3 friends' theories about what his suffering must mean. But at one point in the book, it says that Job wailed his lament, but he committed no sin, nor uttered any insult to God. He simply proclaimed at one point, "Naked I came forth from my mother's womb, and naked shall I go back again. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Now that's a real tough thing to say while you're sitting on a dung heap, as he was. And it didn't happen in the first part of the book. But for an innocent man who suffered, he's a good model to go to and take a look at that book and see how he got from one point to the next. It's a little bit like a group of Jewish people that I heard about who were in a concentration camp. And they decided with the extra time they had to put God on trial, to have kind of a mock trial for neglect and cruelty toward his own chosen people. At the end of the trial, the person playing the judge declared, "This court finds God as guilty." And then he continued by saying, "Now let us go pray." It's that both and again. Let it out, let God have it, God can take it. But stay in relationship with that God. I suppose that my friend Tony, like all of our lost, deceased relatives, friends, loved ones, know now what they didn't know when they were experiencing pain. And maybe his suffering was redemptive for someone else, even if it didn't feel like it to him. I really don't know. But there are times when that one psalm might just make sense for us. And I know some of you have said that's kind of where you are right now. Your psalm to pray might be, "By the rivers of Babylon, we hung up our harps and wept. There was nothing to sing. There was nothing to play. How can we sing songs while we're in this foreign land of exile?" We're going to have to wait until somehow we get out of exile and have a sense of being home again. Ultimately, evil and suffering are mysteries. Ultimately, God is incomprehensible. That's why I invited us right from the beginning in my homilies over the weekend to please come to the mission, ready to let our hearts lead us rather than our heads, because our heads aren't up to it. We can't get our heads around all of this. It's okay to say, "I don't get it. I don't understand it. That's why we call it faith. Some of us had a great discussion on Sunday about faith and science. That gets so blown out of control. And I won't get into it now. But one wise person in the group said, it's faith that seeks understanding, not the other way around. Thank you, descendant of Albert Einstein. It's not that I wait till I get it with my head and then say, okay, now I can believe because I understand it. No, it's the other way around. So let's continue to look at faith, at how our responses to these challenging experiences of suffering, even if they don't have satisfying explanation, can nonetheless profoundly affect our relationships with God, with ourselves, and with each other. And again, that's where the action is. Our spiritual life is about relationship. So now I'm moving into the second part. That's all. There was a girl who used to sit for hours at a time in Italy watching a sculptor working on a big block of Carrara marble. She was really curious for days and weeks to see what each strike of the hammer on the end of a chisel cutting into the hard surface was all about. One day, when the girl showed up, she began to make out for the first time part of the human figure that the master sculptor was creating. And with her eyes wide open, she excitedly asked, "How did you know he was in there?" Isn't that cute? How did you know he was in there? Well, really, that's a story about you and me, except we're not the observers watching the sculptor. We are the emerging creation. We are God's work of art. We are being sometimes slowly and painfully liberated from everything that is not who I was created and called and nurtured to be. In the language of Thomas Merton, the monk, and others who have followed his thought in their writings, I'm talking about what he describes as the false self, as opposed to the true self. And I want to say real clearly, when I'm talking about the false self, I don't mean anything that's bad or anything that's sinful. That's a whole other conversation. The sacrament of reconciliation is a wonderful thing that we have at our disposal in our church, but a whole lot of our woundedness, pain is not self-inflicted. It's not our fault. It just happens. That's what I'm talking about in this mission. The false self is closer, I think, to what we mean when we talk about our egos. It's a part of us that's okay. It's the part that appears to be, hopefully, what others will see me to be. That was a really crazy sentence, wasn't it? I want you to see me in a certain way, and so I put forth that. That's it. There's nothing bad about that, but that's what they're calling the false self. It might be a combination of my personality traits, especially my good ones, my strong ones, my skills, my titles, my job description, who I know, etc., which is a lot easier when people first meet to say, so what do you do, John? Instead of saying, so who are you really? that might scare somebody away on first meeting. The false self is kind of who I think I am, and what I need to hold on to be what I think I am, what I don't think I can live without. It's that kind of insecure, grasping, never-resting self that asks questions like, I hope I'm right. Am I right and not wrong? What's wrong with being wrong? I was wrong at least twice that I can think of. Am I holy enough? Am I doing my faith right? Does it look like I am? Am I attractive? That's a big thing in American culture. Do people like the way I look? What can I do to change it? Am I important? Do I mean something? Am I saying the right prayers? And the questions can go on and on because we all ask ourselves that. Jesus, at can admire the false self. And the story that came to mind as I was writing this was the rich young man who said, look at me, I'm talented, I know my Jewish theology, I know the scriptures, want to hear some answers? Sure. And Jesus was impressed. He said, although it didn't come this way in the scripture, he says, your false self is wonderful. You're really impressive. You're smart. You're good. You're young. Terrific. You've got so much. Now let it all go. Give your riches and the things that you think are your riches away to those who don't have them. And then follow me. And the man walked away sadly. I'd love to know how that story continues and what happened down the road. But what Thomas Merton writes is that we might as well let it go now, because whatever heaven is, in his words, there won't be much of us there. In the sense of, not many of us, he's not saying that, not much of who we think we are there. Because so much of it's false. So much of it's unnecessary. But man, do we hold on to it. And sometimes to the detriment of not knowing our own essence, our own hearts, our own truest self. Of course, there's good reason to identify with this other identity. As we grow up, especially, we develop it, and we have to. We need a persona, we need a face to develop for the public. It's how we get spouses, it's how we get jobs, it's how we get all sorts of things that gives us our little niche in society. We want to present ourselves as competent and likable and successful and knowledgeable and important. It seems harmless enough, except it covers over who I really am, my true self, that a lot of us really don't get to discovering until the second half of our lives. Around All Saints' Day, I often use the image in homilies of how Halloween is the day before, and that after Halloween, all these kids who were scary or who were princesses or whatever, they all take their masks off and return to the innocent faces that are under them. It's the adults who keep the masks on the next day. And think the saints are somebody other than ourselves, rather than taking the mask off and knowing that we're all called to be saints. And to discover that over a lifetime requires me to the rather challenging task of letting go of the identity I've given myself to take on the one that's given me by God. Or, in scriptural words, I put on Christ. Do you know anybody somewhere who struggles with retirement? You know, a lot of people say that I can't wait for it. I mean, my dad was that way. He said it was the best decision I ever made to retire early. Unless my mom was around, then he said it was the second best decision. Marrying her was first. A lot of people do, and I see it with our guys. I don't know if you see it with the priests too. When we identify so much with what we do and what our title is and what our professionalism is and what our job is, when we no longer have it, who are we? You and I are made in God's image. God is not to be made in ours. So we have to discover what that image is in our own selves. Our false selves, in a way, is like that block of marble, compared to what can emerge from within. Now, why am I saying all of this? Remember the chisel? How does this true self emerge? Now, here's the hard part. I only discover that he or she, the true me, is in there when what isn't me gets chiseled away. And one of the things that chisels that away more than anything else is the experience of pain and suffering in our lives. That's what acts as the chisel. It may be the only thing that can adequately confront our human egos. All of a sudden, we're not so important. We're all on the same plane. It might be the only thing that can destabilize our false self that we thought was really us. It's perhaps the only thing that can cause us to find ourselves one day standing raw and naked before God, with none of the other accoutrements, none of the other superficial things to identify with. But this is one of the principal ways that transformation happens. And although it's an ultimately liberating process, like that figure emerging from the block of marble, to become my true self, it also hurts and it feels like I'm dying, because it is a death. But it's the death of my false self. More concretely, let's think of our own experiences of things like, this is where we get into the really heavy stuff: failure, betrayal, loss, debilitating and life-threatening illness, separation from those we love, either by the choice of the people or because someone's taken from us. Ouch. This is the worst part of being human. These are the experiences that cut through our surface, that really do unmask us. Can't fake it anymore. All of a sudden we feel empty and poor and powerless. And the funny thing is that when we're conscious of such feelings, we may or may not realize that we are now in solidarity with the majority of people on the planet who usually feel that way. In America, it doesn't have to be that way, and for the most part it isn't. But for most of the world, that's it. We're all brothers and sisters at that point. There are no important people in hospitals. Just people with sick human bodies who hope they can be healed. I made a men's retreat once when we were asked to wear for the entire weekend only white shirts, because anything with logos or brand names on them would artificially separate us. Either because we're for this sports team rather than that one, or because we have enough money to buy that brand, unlike someone else. Because the retreat leader wanted us to have nothing getting in the way of coming before God as we really are, beginners. Always beginners when we come before God. If I may dare say, we who are Catholic, the majority of us here, perhaps have been misguided to the extent that we've encouraged to just be good, do the right behaviors, and you will ascend to higher and higher levels of holiness to strive for perfection. I don't think that works. Anybody here get there? Anybody perfect? Okay, just wondering. Again, that kind of behavior is good for children. They have to learn how to be good and how to be better. And maybe people in the first half of lives who are still creating who they need to be before others, and who need guidelines, and who want, who desire a sense of achievement. We all do. It makes sense. But let's read the scriptures with new eyes, and probably those new eyes will include glasses, because these are the people in the second half of life who start reading and realize, you know what? Everything I know isn't all that important. Knowledge is less important than wisdom. The more I read here, the teachings of Jesus are more about falling than they are about climbing. He's asking us more often to let go than he is to hold on. It almost seems like we finally get who God is when we fail and are forgiven, rather than pretend we're doing it all right. The people Jesus were hardest on were the self-righteous people who thought they had it all together. The gospel is a really radical message, and it hasn't always been preached that way. It's been preached as a moral guideline, or as a guilt-inducing sort of thing in so many circles for so much time. Or else we've been taught to strive for perfection. Wow, I don't know which preacher is doing that, because if he's looking at himself, it's not going to happen. We're called to let go. We're to love our enemies. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hang out at the bottom of the social ladder, because that's not the way God sees it. Blessed are those who suffer for the sake of justice. It's all upside down, just like I said on Saturday and Sunday. And if there's any going up going on, it's not us who are doing it, it's God who's lifting us. It's God who's raising us. It's by the power of God. Our job as followers of Jesus is to descend, to surrender, to let go, to die. Is that challenging? Yeah, it's challenging as heck. But to all those who suffer and are comforted, to all those who lose and discover things they never would have found otherwise, to those who feel excluded but end up being included by this universality, it's not just challenging, it's darn comforting. For all of that dissent, that pain, that letting go, is what makes us more ready to receive the gentle and transforming power of God's Spirit. God's Spirit who touches us right where it hurts and makes us strong precisely at the weak spots. That's what the Spirit of God does. We can leave out the Spirit of God by being strong all by ourselves. Addicts who hit bottom can teach all the rest of us how this works. It's one of the best spiritualities that's ever been invented. Addicts turn to a higher power. They say they're powerless. They do it in front of others. They have fellowship and they find new strength and a new relationship with God. The great Martin Luther King prayed near the end of his life, "Now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. But I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I have come to the point where I can no longer face it alone." And he writes in his book after that prayer, "At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before." People like us who suffer and who walk through our pain together with Jesus, and hopefully with some other good guides who are there to companion us, begin to understand why Jesus said that those who mourn are blessed. Along with those who admit how poor and needy and limited and vulnerable we are, for it's when we're brought to that state that we let in love so much more readily to heal us and show us who we really are. When we stop climbing, we can fall back into our true and absolute identity in Christ. It's like almost like undergoing an identity transplant. But we're following the one who had that happen twice in his life. First, he let go of his grasp of equality with God to take on human flesh, and then he let go of that human flesh to take on a new kind of body of which we are now all part. I think we can say, theologically correctly, that Jesus died and Christ rose. For, Christ isn't his last name, right? Everybody knows that. More accurately, it's our last name. We are the body of Christ. Mind-blowing, isn't it? And then this Jesus says to us, with every blow of life's chisel, follow me. That is, follow the pattern of dying and being raised that he models for the rest of us as the firstborn from the dead. How are you doing? Exhausted? Confused? Challenged? Excited? Upset? Comforted? I never know how a message like this is going to come across, and probably a little bit of all of those. However each of you hears these words, and whether you focus more on the chisel that you might be feeling right now, or the spirituality of dissent that I challenge us all to take a look at rather than trying to climb, or simply saying, I'm just trying to follow Jesus. If you help, that's great. That's all I want to do. This is how transformation happens. This is how we become our true selves. This is one of the ways that our suffering can be called redemptive. Because it restores us to relationship. In this case, relationship with our own deepest selves, with who we truly are, and therefore with Christ living in us in whom we live and move and have our being, and with the Creator, with whom Christ is always one. Abba and I are one. The Father and I are one. This is amazing what's happening. Such transformation changes our motives, too. Talk about growing up. Instead of behaving a certain way now because Jesus says we're supposed to, I'm behaving in a certain way because that's the way Christ behaved, and I'm behaving as Christ. Because that's who I really am down deep. We're all his body. Yeah, it's a painful mystery, and it's a wonderful one. Both, and there we go again. And it's complex. I understand that. I'm not doing simple stuff for you in this mission, but it's really no more complex than trying to explain another transformation, the one that occurs on the altar here, at every Eucharist. One little boy at Mass turned to his father and told him he had to go to the bathroom. So the father said, "Can you wait for just 2 minutes because we're at a really important part of the Mass now? You know, look up there. The priest is going to take the bread and the wine and turn it into Jesus." And so the little boy says, "Okay," and he just stares at the priest. After about a minute and a half, he looks back at his dad and says, "Looks like it didn't work. Now can I go to the bathroom?" And that might be how some of us feel now. Father John, now can we go to the bathroom? We needed a little humor in the middle of that. But let's remember also something that I had said earlier, and that you probably know. Along with suffering, the other thing that has the capacity for this kind of transformation is love. And I just want to make sure I come back to that too. When I know that I'm loved by someone, that's going to end up unmasking me too. And although I might think, oh boy, now the other person is going to see who I really am ends up being better than I might have tried to impress the other with, rather than worse. Because now I can trust that I will be accepted just as I am. That's how all your marriages are, correct? And who I am is good. It may not feel like that as parts of me are chipped or chiseled away or stripped away to make that happen, as it does in any relationship where we rub against each other in a context of love, but I allow it to happen because I trust the one who loves me. It might still hurt, but I would dare say that these are growing pains. Maturing love is always going to involve experiences of pain along the way. Isn't that true? Or am I wrong there? Okay, I want to make sure it's not celibate saying another stupid thing. But I do have love relationships in my life, please. Ready for part 3? After looking at positive response to suffering and its role in the process of transformation, now we go to the heart of it all, the cross on Calvary, where we see both the love and the suffering somehow mixed up together in a way that none of us quite understand, or at least have a real hard time articulating. So I'm going to have a hard time too, but I'll try. The cross. What a hard piece of our faith. Really, if somebody else, if an alien came down and said, who do you worship? And we told the story, they said, oh my God, I never would have created a story like that about my God. It's hard to stay connected for long. Sometimes we believe it, and then we stumble over it. We pop back into the wisdom of the world, what Paul called the human wisdom, forgetting that we're followers of the one we call Lord, but it was a Lord who waited tables and washed feet. We say every Sunday we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, but we know that in order to receive that Spirit and be empowered by that Spirit and healed, we need to give up all the illusions that we know how to save ourselves. And couldn't God have come up with a different method by which to save us? Why? The crucifixion. Well, that's a short question with a long, long, long history of people trying to answer it. I'm not going to try to answer it. I'd like to say a couple of things, though, to put at least one idea to rest that we sometimes have among ourselves. And that's somehow that God wanted Jesus to suffer. and to have his son killed. Or, I guess the way we say it sometimes to feel a little better is that he allowed it to happen. And again, this is open to interpretation, obviously, but to me it sounds like a pretty sadistic God, rather than that insanely loving God that we encountered last night, who had the wild idea to give us all freedom and choice and the power to name and to create and to act. And in so doing, we also have the freedom to make bad decisions and to mess stuff up. You and I have the power to resist God, and sometimes we do. Often it's much more comfortable. But what if, and this is just a what if, this isn't the gospel I'm preaching at this point, what if God, the Abba of Jesus, really wanted the Son to have a long life and success? And that his death was the frustration of God's will. That somehow the world said no to God's yes. In that light, it's not that Jesus came to pay our bills. Rather, he died because he just wouldn't stop being his true self. He wouldn't stop being who he truly is. There's one school of thought, the majority of thought probably in the history of theology, that believes that Jesus died in place of us, kind of an atonement theory. But I transferred to another school at one point, and I believe another approach that what Jesus did is actually show the rest of us how to live and how to die. And a lot of it's by being completely true to himself. Doing that, he challenged and upset the authorities, both the civil ones and the religious ones, who told him to knock it off. And he could have stopped. He could have stopped operating in the open, and he could have gone underground. He could have stopped being such an activist and written books about it himself. He could have saved the evangelists the trouble of writing the Gospels. He could have stopped helping others and helped himself. Rather, when Judas and the others, the soldiers, came to arrest him in the garden, he just stood up very straight and said, "Yes, that's me. I am the one you're looking for. I've always been the one that you say I am now," and ask if I'm the one. Yeah, you saw me out there. You know what I taught. You know what I did. You know how I healed. You know my message. Don't ask stupid questions. I have never stopped being who I am. If Jesus had denied that, as Peter would shortly, he might have saved his life in the short run, but he would have lost it in the long run. And while he surrendered to those who arrested him, what he never surrendered was his total integrity, and that was his only crime, as other people saw it. His integrity that led him to do things that threatened them. He made people aware of God's kingdom, which threatened the heck out of everybody's little kingdoms. So they had him killed. It's better that one man. So rather than saying, as we so often do, that it was God's will that Jesus be crucified and died, might we consider instead saying that it's God's will that Jesus lived the way he did and knew that living that way could end up with his execution for all practical purposes. The possibility of death, not something that God desired or even allowed, but something that God suffered. As God suffers with us, as Kayla Mueller discovered a suffering God in Syria. Christianity is the only religion in the world, I think, that confesses a God who suffers. God's power does not force our human choices. We can make them bad ones. And God's power does not end human pain. Instead, it's a power to pick up the shattered pieces and to make something holy and new out of them. And to do it not from a distance, but to do it up close and intimate in our human brother, Jesus. And in doing that, Jesus revolutionized the history of religion. For centuries, religions felt that they had to please God. They did it in some horrible ways. They sacrificed animals, and before that, they even sacrificed humans at times. It's the scapegoat theory that's alive and well. Maybe not in religion or killing animals, although I know every time I go to Africa, I see goats that are there ready for sacrifice in some of the African religions. But it's rather the way that we look for someone to blame, someone to accuse, someone whose fault it is. Let's attack them, let's torture them, let's imprison them. It's that either-or approach again that says, I'm the good guy, you're the bad guy. Rather than that little girl whose teacher asked her, if green means good and red means bad, what color would you say? And she thought for a moment, looked at her teacher and said, I think I'd be kind of stripy. For the first time in history, blood was not shed to appease a god, but blood was shed by God to dramatically expose the sin of the world in the death by crucifixion of an innocent man. Rather than just tell us about all that, Jesus dramatically showed us this historic pattern that had been our history of ignorant killing, attacking, and blaming. It's all a lie, he said, by being on the cross. Through the very act of being hated and put to death, he showed us the greatest love. He turned the worst thing into the best thing. That's why we hang them up in our rooms. He gave himself up to death and turned an execution into the greatest demonstration of selfless love in the history of the world. Just to use an image, it's always hard to get our minds around this, and I can't. Think of Jesus as an electric transformer, doing what an electric transformer does. It receives at one end all the highly charged energy of things like hatred and ignorance and scapegoating. It's better that one man die than the whole nation. And instead of doing what most of history had done, putting up a shield, sending it back, an eye for an eye, vengefully turning it back on his persecutors, pulling the nails out of the cross, coming down and beating everybody up and telling the Romans to leave. Instead, he took all that negative energy and converted it, as it were, into new forms of energy that he already started demonstrating right there on the cross. You, repentant thief, will have paradise. You, ignorant executioners, you're forgiven. That's what I give back to you for what you did to me. And you, mother, you, son, a new community begins. Take care of each other. Remember what happened. And then that power converted through the innocent one who makes himself the Lamb of God, the scapegoat. It continues in that whole event and reality that we can't describe, what we call it, resurrection. And then the sending of the Holy Spirit. And then the rest of the history of the church, of all of us, our history of his followers, to continue the mission and answer our call to be transformers ourselves of hurt and pain and suffering into something positive, forgiving, compassionate, and loving. This radical event became the new center of history. Time was measured by it. Everything that happened was either before this or after this, at least in the Western world. I like the image of the transformer a lot. I didn't make it up. I can't take credit for it. I like it to illustrate the mystery, but it still doesn't mean I really understand it. But that's okay, because I don't think Jesus came to explain suffering to us. He came to suffer with us and to weep. I think the best way to understand is to stand under the cross for a long time. I think the only way to gradually make more and more sense of all this is not what you're doing now, listening to someone talk about it, but to spend minutes, hours, months, and years to contemplatively gaze at the crucified one and to let his gaze, full of love, back at us, with merciful love, change us from the bottom up, starting with the areas that hurt the most, because he understands them. Only that kind of love empowers us to deal with our sufferings and wounds the way that he did. section now. It's about our wounds, how we've been hurt, and how we might unite those to that of Jesus, what that might mean. And I want to begin this last section, following from what I've just said, with a statement that has become a central learning for me over the past maybe 10 or 15 years. When we take the pain and suffering of our lives to heart, not just try to figure it out and how to avoid it, but when we take it to heart and to the heart of Jesus, it does have a chance of being transformed into something else. Now here's the lesson. When our wounds are not transformed, they end up being transmitted. When our wounds are not transformed, they end up being transmitted. When we don't allow our wounds to be touched by Jesus in our hearts, somebody else is going to pay for our being hurt, probably by my hurting them. Those are how the dysfunctional cycles happen in nations, in ethnic groups, in families. Someone hurts me, somebody's going to pay for it. I'm going to pass on the hurt and let the cycle continue because it's all I know without that transformation and healing. I'm going to take it out maybe on someone who has no idea what's going on in me, and I can't remember what happened, but someone says something to me or looks at me in a strange way and reopens the wound that hasn't been transformed with some innocent comment or look, and I let them have it. I need healing. That's kind of the theory of why people who have been abused don't necessarily learn from it, but abuse the next generation. Unless someone stops the cycle, it continues. Maybe that's original sin, I don't know. People who are hurt end up hurting others, unless we say, stop. So how might your suffering and mine become transformed rather than transmitted in such a way that I can become a compassionate, wounded healer myself? All of those parts. Wounded, compassionate, and healer. And in a word, now this is not going to be, here, write it down, go home and try it. In a word, this is tough, but we do it best by doing what I just suggested, by spending time at the foot of the cross. Learning not only from Jesus, but also learning from the woman who stands there with her son. There's a novel by a man named Ken Follett in which a statue of Our Lady of Sorrows begins weeping. It's a fake, but she begins weeping, and this woman takes it very seriously. A woman who lost her son in an earthquake experiences healing and says the first words that she was able to utter since the loss of her son. And she points to the statue of Mary and says, she understands. My guess is that Mary understood some things at the foot of the cross that she hadn't understood previously and probably still didn't get it all. When St. Luke says that she treasured these things in her heart, the way I've come to translate that is, well, it happened, I don't get it, but I'm just not going to forget it, and I'm going to reflect on it. And one event that might have come to mind that she didn't forget standing at the foot of the cross was way back when Jesus was a newborn. And Simeon in the temple told her that this child was going to slice open the hearts of people to reveal who they really are. And that her own heart would be pierced by a sword. It would cause her pain. And I'm not sure that the pain of the loss of her son wasn't equal to the pain of the fact that people didn't get him, that they rejected him, that they abandoned him. Where's everybody else at the foot of the cross? Seems like most of the people here are jeering, and the support crowd is all hiding and shaking in the upper room somewhere. Now she gets it. At this event on Calvary is breaking her heart. And some of us here tonight know how that feels. There are also those among us, as I've mentioned, who are members of the family of Servites, the servants of Mary. We take Our Lady of Sorrows as our patroness. Some people think that's kind of sick and sad, but I think just the opposite. She's the one who can teach us what to do with these events of our lives. Our patroness didn't run away, like most of the guys. She stands there at the cross. It didn't say she swooned and fainted. She stands there looking at her good, spirit-filled son, an innocent victim of the system, the one who did God's will and said he did it as his very bread and sustenance. And she's absolutely powerless to do anything to change the situation. She can't save her own son. She can't end his pain. She takes it on herself. And yet she's our inspiration because she remains with him, allows herself to feel his pain, and even as she grieves his loss, she continues to trust that the God that she once sang about as having done great things in her is going to do a great thing with this too. The one whom she has proclaimed with her entire being, she trusts against all odds that God has not abandoned her nor abandoned his son. And she teaches us in the process what a quiet but effective ministry it can be to simply be with someone, to feel with someone, to suffer with another. She models for us that ministry of presence and also witnesses the mystery of contradiction that's formed by the very shape of the cross, with its extremes up and down, left and right. Let's watch the cross with her. Let's look at it. Let's realize that Jesus is teaching us this new way to deal with suffering. Behold the cross, on one hand, a revelation of horrible evil. On the other hand, one of incredibly generous and sacrificial love. Behold the cross in which hangs a victim of the system, but doesn't play the victim or create new victims, but instead becomes the victor over death itself, receiving hatred, but not returning it. Suffering without making somebody else suffer because of it. Behold the cross on which those with power over him punishes him, while he demonstrates power for others that changes them. Behold the cross on which we see the ugliness of all the violence and hate and sin in its worst possible form, and how Jesus absorbs and transforms it all into words of forgiveness and promise and care for a mother and a beloved disciple. Behold the worst thing ever and the best thing ever, and all of these paradoxes and apparent opposites are stretching us out the way they stretched him out. What a clash. What a mystery to see them both there. Horrible hatred, profound love. Jesus holding the tension between them in himself rather than warring back, and doing it in a way that can disarm and soften the heart of anyone who dares to behold that scene, to look at him long enough. As we contemplate the cross and meditate on our own lives and our pain and suffering, just as these opposite forces stretch Jesus out on the cross, we might feel ourselves being stretched too. But when we're stretched like this, and you can try it sometime at home, what do you feel in the middle of your body? Our whole heart space opens up in a way that it's normally not open. And that's what leads us to dare to step closer to that cross, led by our hearts, and then listening with our hearts to Jesus saying, "Why have you forsaken me?" And we might be saying something similar like the psalmist. "Oh Lord, how long is this suffering that I'm feeling supposed to happen? How long does it go on? How long?" And maybe in our contemplative prayer we might hear at some point, "How long, you ask? Maybe until you learn what you need to learn in the experience and through it. How long? Maybe until you realize that life is less about you and more about me. How long? Maybe until you realize that being good and strong and right isn't as important as when you're broken and wounded like me, to let me in to heal you and make you strong at the broken places. How long? until you stop suffering by yourself and let me in there with you. Or by coming with your suffering to my cross, so that instead of being paralyzed by pain or transmitting it to someone else, I, your God, Jesus, can transform your pain into sacred wounds. And then, you who have been humbled by pain can experience your own suffering as a gift of compassion for someone else who's also wounded, who also is in pain of any kind. We might hear Jesus saying, "Let me empower you to help stop the violence, because it all results from our false selves. And it continues to crucify our brothers and sisters, my living body." He might say, no, don't look away. I know this is a tough scene. Don't look away. Keep looking and feel my loving power until you know to the depths of your soul that the only thing that truly heals and transforms is my unbelievable, unconditional love for you. Is there anything else I could do to convince you of that? Until then, you might continue to stumble over my cross, see it as foolish, as many people do. But to the degree that you embrace my cross in your own life, you'll know my healing love. It's been said that Mary of Nazareth, his mother and his disciple, was kind of a bridge between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. If we have the courage to get ourselves to the cross and to embrace it, there's no promise of instantaneous magic, but we can, with Mary, spend that Holy Saturday with her. Might be a long one, might be a real long one, of waiting and hoping and praying for some transformation to happen. It doesn't happen as automatically as the 1, 2, 3 steps I'm saying. For the wound to become a gift for somebody else. It might not be quick to have mourning turning into dancing, or something that hurts to become brand new. That part is all about grace, and that's out of our hands. That's God's job. And our new friend Job reminds us that God may not answer our questions as we wish, but rather make it very clear that God's own self is the answer. And interestingly, when God finally spoke to the innocent Job, Job discovered that God really had been listening to him all along. Do you and I trust that God is hearing us too, especially when we talk about our pain? I think it's time to enter into prayer. It's time for me to stop talking. And it's time for a real prayer, one that incorporates our sufferings and our wounds and our scars into the very prayer itself, with the use of symbols and gestures that we Catholics are so good at with our sacramental signs. When we celebrate healing tomorrow, and I invite you to come back for that, I will say more things about the role of the community in the healing of us all. But before we come back to celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus in the Eucharist, let us bravely and with hope come to the cross of Jesus. You see there's some pottery additional from this beautiful display in front of me. It's made of clay. You know the word Adam in Genesis, Adam is all about clay. God breathed life into clay. God breathes life into us. The image is used of our being earthen vessels. Paul talks about us that way. And what a variety of earthen vessels there we are, short, tall, thin, less thin. All the variety of people, beautiful in our diversity, and yet all fragile. We're not robots. We can get nicked, we can get scarred. As beautiful as our humanity is, as wonderful as it is to be human, life happens. We've been talking about that. Things happen that we'd rather not have happened. And then all of a sudden, the fragility of the earthen vessel
is truly as experienced in its fragility. Can I ask my 4 helpers to come up, please? Even what looks strongest, even what seems most beautiful in the eyes of the world, the 4 gentlemen here are going to pick up these shards of our humanity, these symbols, if we would, of our wounds, and pass the baskets. And I ask you carefully, in case there are sharp edges, to take one of those and to give it the name of that hurt that you would most like to bring to the cross of Jesus at this time in your life, in this week, in this mission, for the purpose of healing. Give it a name. Spend a little time. We're going to have absolute silence for the first part of this. Hold it. Get the contours of it. Describe it. What has it done in my life? What has its role been? Have I learned anything from it, or maybe not? How much does it hurt? And we might have to pass it to each other down the pews. That might be the easiest way, guys. And I want to read that one part that I had read earlier that might make a little more sense now after everything else that's been shared this evening. This is what I said near the beginning of the evening. I said, here we are, and we continue to be, in our beloved, imperfect humanity, which necessarily includes the experience of pain and suffering. There is an alternative, which includes, instead of running from the pain, making peace with what's just there and unchangeable for the moment, and choosing the attitude that we're going to take toward it. I can hold that pain now and be angry with it. Maybe that's where I am right now. I can choose a different kind of approach toward suffering, a hopeful attitude, a dignified one, and say, I'm giving it a name. This is what it is. This is my hurt. This is my loss. This is my wound. I'm not going to keep it private. I'm not going to say what it is, but I'm going to expose it clearly to God in the presence of the community. And in that sentence where I gave a lot of verbs, to face them, to name them, to cry and scream and lament them, which we've probably done before tonight, to share them with others,
And then, this is kind of what I'm asking you to do in part, and then sit with them quietly. And maybe even rock them gently, because they're a part of my life. With the hope that by bringing them to the cross of Jesus, God can break through and do something brand new, and I will feel healed. Again, in perfect silence, let's just be there and have a conversation with what hurts, with what's tough right now. And let it talk back. What does it have to say to you? Does it have any sense or meaning? Or is it just saying, please do something with me? Some of you may need less time, some of you may need more time. But when you feel that's something you've already been walking around with, but now hold in your hand, gently, loosely, as part of who you are, but not the truest self, and a part that can be healed, if you decide that you would like to consciously bring that wound to the cross, to connect your pain and suffering with that of Jesus, in the hope that God knows what to do with our pain and can in fact transform it because of what God did in raising Jesus even from death. If you'd like to be part of that in a more conscious and active way, when you're ready, come up with your wound and place it at the foot of the cross, so that instead of transferring it to somebody else, or having it eat away at you on the inside, Jesus can receive it, bring it into his own suffering and pain, and transform it. That's all we can do. The rest is up to God. When you're ready to come up, just do it spontaneously.
Creator God, gentle God, compassionate God, God who suffers with us. Our lives have been wounded, our innocence has been lost. Our bodies, our spirits, our minds have been broken. But we are here tonight trusting that you can make us whole. Because we believe that you raised the broken, hurting, crucified Jesus to a brand new life. And we sense his living presence here among us as our very human brother and as our risen Lord. And so we have followed you to the cross. And we place there our wounds, our pain, our suffering. We join it to that of your Son, whose risen body we now are, though not yet complete and still hurting. So as we walk away from this holy place tonight, continue to touch us at the broken places. Make us strong. May our very brokenness be what opens us to receive the healing of your Spirit, for which we will continue to pray tomorrow when we gather once again. Stay with us, God. Bless us. Comfort us. Deepen our faith and trust in you, and heal our hurts. Let's conclude this evening with a musical prayer.
Alleluia.